The rise in popularity of replicas started in the Victorian era, with many castles, houses and interior decorations built around the Gothic style. However, these were never intended for an educational use, but rather for decorative and to show off. However, in the modern day, we have many uses for replicas. We can use them for display purposes, for education, and we can even use them for destructive testing. This is a process that involves heavy use of a tool or weapon to test its capabilities, strengths, weaknesses, and usage parameters. This style of testing can't be done on an original artifact due to the breakage and the significant losses incurred to historical databanks. Many historians debate the use of replicas and their use in a museum, with many claiming that replicas don't have the aura of the original piece, whereas others claim that the aura is transferable and is based rather on the viewer's experience of the piece. So sometimes a replica may seem more real than the original because it can be held, touched, felt and used. This debate on the aura also swings the other way, as replicas don't have the historical precedent of their originals. They do, however, have their own aura, in and of the fact that they are themselves a replica. Replicas made within the Victorian era are still replicas, however they have their own historical precedent due to their age. Another factor that can make a replica have an aura is its creation process and the knowledge behind it. It's often very difficult to picture a medieval blacksmith making a sword. However, when you can see a modern day person create a sword, and then you can hold the sword itself, there's more of a connection to the maker and to the piece itself. Once the replica has been handled, this connection can then be likened back to the original, so when the original is viewed, you can empathise with the creator, and you can almost imagine the creation process that they're going through at the time. Modern creation processes often differ to their original counterparts, primarily due to tools, experience, and materials available. Throughout this creation process, you'll see me use a variety of different power tools and non-traditional tools. The reason that I chose to do this is to make up for my lack of experience compared to a 17th century blacksmith. This also speeds up the creation process significantly. However, some areas physically can't be sped up. These include things such as the hand sanding and the handle shaping processes. But how much does that actually matter? Does it matter whether a replica is handmade or machine-made? Well, as with many of these questions, it matters to a point. If a replica is entirely machine-made, it loses some of that aura and the physical connection that you get to the maker from holding the item. It serves the function, but it's almost too perfect. The majority of handmade arms and armour have these tiny little imperfections, and each of them tells a story of the process. During this piece of construction, I had issues with the heat treatment process, which has left a mark on the blade towards the tip, which you can see on the final project. However, these marks tell the story of the piece and the struggles that went into its manufacture, adding to its auratic qualities. On the other hand, some kind of machine input is incredibly difficult to avoid in the modern day and age. For instance, drills and drill presses that were around in the 1600s are quite difficult to get hold of now. So you'll find that holes are drilled most often with an electric drill. Time constraints are also an issue on many of these pieces. For instance, this project had to be completed in about a month. Therefore, I didn't have time to outsource and learn how to use a stone wheel grinder. Instead, I used the belt sander, which I previously had experience with. I did, however, attempt to use traditional tools as much as physically possible. I didn't use the belt sander when making the handle, and instead I did the whole thing using chisels, knives and planes. One other major advantage to a historian creating a replica, rather than just a manufacturer, is that we can learn about the processes ourselves, and we can learn about some techniques that were used by the original creators that would otherwise be completely lost. For instance, when grinding the fullers on the contact wheel, I found that changing the approach angle would change the radius of the fuller that I was grinding. angling the blade along the XY axis towards the wheel would decrease the diameter of the effective contact wheel, which would mean that I can grind deeper into the blade. Similarly, changing the angle of the blade on the Z coordinate would mean that the fuller would increase in diameter, which would mean that I could grind wider fullers without having to cut too deeply. Due to the cost of tools and tooling, I can see that this technique would have been used traditionally in order to make one tool do the job of many. It also allows for the use of distal tapers, a tapering grind from the handle towards the tip, which would reduce the weight and yet keep the structural integrity. I have found no papers or records of this kind of technique in any archive, and is therefore something that can only be learnt by doing. If historians went out and took a physical approach to other artefact investigations, we might broaden and depthen our historical knowledge of the era, the craftsmanship, and the processes involved in these pieces. Usage of historical replicas in curatorial settings are of great importance to both the continued research into our artefacts and in the engagement, education, and entertainment of visitors in our museums and curatorial spaces. During the research for this project, I interviewed 2 curators and asked their opinions on the use of replicas. Here are some of their responses. As a curator/historian, what usage would you put a reproduction to?
Having on display and making it accessible. I would use it for teaching purposes, so we're hoping to do more visits to almost making the field trip to schools, especially in light of COVID and coming out of lockdowns. People scale back spending money on coach trips to places like our space, so we're wondering if we can go visit them, and taking a historic collection is maybe something you don't want to do, insurance and costs, but if you had a reproduction of what it once looked like and how it was made, an accurate reproduction, this facsimile could offer a great deal of benefit to showcase to a wider audience the object.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I can't think of anything now, but I think we need to be doing more with 3D scanning and augmented realities. We have a VR headset that might be, you can see here, to help tell a story, especially when things are missing in the story of an object. So again, going back to our example of the ruins, to fill in the blanks and tell the rest of that story. All of these things, and we were discussing earlier holograms, so holograms could offer something much more to the museum space.
So what place do you think that reproductions have in academia?
I think, again, from an educational point of view, it's getting that hands-on experience, but also from an accessibility point of view. If you have someone that, say, is blind or has vision impairment, rather than trying to describe what a sword is, you could literally let them hold it. And because it's a reproduction, it doesn't matter. If it gets damaged, you can then reproduce it again.
So as a curator or historian, what usage would you put a reproduction to?
From my day-to-day life at the castle, we always put it towards talks, tours, reenactment, and accessibility. We get a lot of children that come to the castle, hundreds of thousands of people a year. And rather than saying to a kid, "Oh, there's a sword, it weighs this much," to actually give them the sword and say, "This is how much it weighs," and they can feel it. It really brightens their day, and I think it gives the general public in particular a better understanding of what life was like centuries ago, as opposed to seeing things on TV shows or movies that aren't entirely accurate. When you come into a castle or a historic building and you can actually feel the history in your hands, it really does make a difference to their day and to our day.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And let's not delete. As we can see from these interviews, the curators that are actively running these exhibitions and museums are very interested in the use of replicas. Many different possibilities and styles of replicas can be used for different purposes, with 3D printing, holograms, and physical reproductions all being suggestions and use cases. However, the study of replicas and the use of them by the historian is lacking and needs to be investigated in order to further our understanding of artefacts and of curation as a whole.